Now, one of the reasons, as I said earlier, because of Aboriginal policy failings, has been the history of policies jumping all over the place. And a large part of why these policies have been jumping all over the place is because they've lacked a very important backbone, and that backbone is a consultation model with Aboriginal people. Okay, so that's very important, and that can keep things structured in terms of Aboriginal policy. Another issue that has not really been discussed is the issue of representation. Now, representation is a very difficult, complex matter, and many people say that the issue of representation is the reason why there will never be a treaty between Aboriginal people and the Australian government. Now, what I mean by representation is who speaks for who. Okay? So do the traditional owners of somewhere in New South Wales determine things with the Australian government on behalf of all Aboriginal people? Do Aboriginal people from Darwin determine things on behalf of all Aboriginal people? Of course they don't. All these groups require their own representation. So it's a very difficult thing, and it's something that needs to be addressed, this issue of representation. Now, because of the lack of consultation with Aboriginal people in the area of Aboriginal policy development, Aboriginal people have had to struggle for generations for equality. Many people do not realise how this struggle took place and that it actually occurred. It's very common today for people in Australia to say that Aboriginal people get free houses and free cars. All this does, because of its inaccuracy, is show you how much Aboriginal people, how much people in Australia rather, don't know about Aboriginal people and Aboriginal policy, because Aboriginal people have never got free houses and free cars, and all you would need to do is go to an Aboriginal community and walk around there for 10 minutes to see that. If these things took place, there would be no Closing the Gap program, which is aimed at eliminating the things that contribute to Aboriginal people dying about 20 years earlier than other Australians. These notions about Aboriginal people getting free houses and free cars, all they do is show you how much people do not know, because it doesn't happen. There is no government department that gives Aboriginal people these things. We see these things with terms such as sit-down money and unemployment benefits. Socially, the view is if you're Aboriginal and you're on Centrelink payments, you get sit-down money. But that sit-down money term is never applied to non-Aboriginal people who society is saying are getting an unemployment benefit. Why are we using different terminology there? The fact of the matter is Aboriginal people have been working for this sit-down money since the 1970s under the Community Development Employment Program, CDEP, okay, which is only a new initiative in mainstream Australia. So Aboriginal people have never been given anything. They've had to struggle for everything, for basic citizenship rights, as we saw with Vincent Lingiari and his people, who went on strike for 8 years in the 1960s for equal wages and working conditions. So all of these struggles actually came to the fore throughout the 1960s, and they actually resulted in more people becoming more aware of Aboriginal struggles. All of a sudden, large groups of Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people were marching through streets demanding land rights, demanding Aboriginal people receive equality. Okay, so all of these things really gained momentum in the late 1960s. Other advances that came about through the struggles of Aboriginal people include the policy of self-determination, which was introduced in 1972, discussions, at least, of a treaty, the Native Title Act, and the creation of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which of course saw Aboriginal people being elected into positions to represent other Aboriginal people for the first time. Then of course we had the decade of reconciliation. Now, the lack of government consultation that I spoke about is continuing to happen today. Now, one example of this is the super shire proposal. The NT government's position is that the creation of these super communities will make it more productive for them to deliver health, education and housing services, for example. The NT government are taking the approach that they will not allocate funds for these government services to the ancestral lands, the traditional lands of Aboriginal people. This of course means that if Aboriginal people are going to receive basic citizenship services such as health, education and housing, they are going to have to relocate from their traditional homelands into these super shires. Now, one of the reasons given for this was so that Aboriginal people could live as the rest of Australians. Now, this shows you the lack of consultation, because Aboriginal people, the most important thing to them is their land. Their land is their identity. Their whole reason for living is so they can look after their land, because if they don't look after their land, they will suffer the consequences. To access basic services, they have to leave their land. Again, this is a form, many Aboriginal people would say, of assimilation. Other Aboriginal people may say that it's a good idea. These people, of course, are not listening to the Aboriginal people who are saying they don't want to leave their traditional lands. And one of the things that often happens is governments will have Aboriginal people, this happens around the world, talk for them on their behalf, when the Aboriginal people that are talking for them on their behalf do not have a mandate to represent their people. So you'll have various Indigenous advisory committees where governments around the world employ Indigenous people who do not have qualifications or industry experience in the areas that they are providing advice on, so these people cannot argue with the government. So these people just get along with the government, so they do not raise issues with the government. This is a way governments have done things for a long time with Indigenous policy. So governments have not worked with Aboriginal people when they have developed policies for Aboriginal people. Instead, they have tried to find the solutions for the Aboriginal problems and have taken the approach that they are developing policies that are for Aboriginal people's own good. Okay, so for example, many of you have probably heard that the removal of Aboriginal children, which was a policy, was for their own good. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean it was. In fact, I have never heard anything so stupid and ridiculous. Let me tell you why. When you are the government, your responsibility is to provide people with health care, education, housing, a labour market. If you are not providing this to one group of people who are Aboriginal people, who are only getting rations of flour, sugar and tea, they of course are not going to be able to look after their children to the same extent as those in society who are receiving all the services you are providing and are ensuring are receiving award wages, superannuation, etc. So if the government of the day just ensured that the Aboriginal parents were receiving the same services and the same legal care as white Australian parents, this whole issue about it being for their own good would not apply. The issue is, why weren't Aboriginal parents provided with the same means to look after their kids as other parents? Okay, so we are not talking rocket science here. It's a pretty basic notion. Again, things don't have to be correct if they have existed in society for a long time. When views have become entrenched in society, people just accept them even though they are inaccurate. So many people would argue, for example, that the intervention has nothing to do with dysfunctional Aboriginal communities. It is more about failings in government policies. Wherever you have a group of people in a remote location with low levels of education, a shortage of housing, poor health care, a lack of employment opportunities, and a shortage of policing, there are going to be problems. Okay? So often the way policies are presented to society in terms of Indigenous affairs are worded to be misleading, okay? And that goes right back to the notion of terra nullius, okay, which, as I said, was only dismissed in the early 1990s. Now what I want to do is I want to spend a few minutes talking about governance. If you're not really familiar with this term governance, I can confidently say that you will be over the coming weeks, okay? So don't be scared by it. Try to understand it, but don't try to take it all in at once, okay? Because governance is something that people typically develop knowledge about through experiences. Now, governance. The thing about governance is if Indigenous people around the world want to take more control of their own lands and their own problems, they are going to need good systems of governance. Without good governance, Indigenous people will achieve very little. If anything, a lack of good governance can result in intended or unintended social and community conflict, misspending, corruption and nepotism, all of which can cause organisations and communities to collapse. The Indigenous organisations that do well do so because of good governance. Good governance means that things have structure and order, that there is consistency, transparency and accountability. Governance is about Indigenous people making decisions for themselves. This means that it is crucial that Indigenous people are involved in the formulation of governance guidelines, as it needs to make sense to them. Look, the fact of the matter is there is not one Indigenous organisation or corporation in Australia that does not exist independently of Western regulators, okay? So there is a Commonwealth Government agency called the Office of the Register for Indigenous Corporations. If you are an Indigenous corporation or organisation, or you intend to be, you have to satisfy the requirements that they set out for you to be recognised by them as an Indigenous corporation or organisation. So what I might get you to do, just pick up your pens and papers here and just make a note to go and check out the Office of the Register for Indigenous Corporations webpage and have a look around at some of their fact sheets and why they exist. Have a look at the CATSI, C-A-T-S-I Act, and then maybe next week we'll have a discussion about that on the discussion board. So again, make a note, look at the ORIC website. So in terms of Indigenous governance, there is a lack of quality governance, often because people do not have the appropriate industry experience or the levels of education or good levels of English to understand what good Western governance is all about. There needs to be a national approach to Indigenous governance. At the moment, Indigenous governance training occurs on an ad hoc basis. This can include the national approach that I'm talking about could include dedicated training units, on-the-job training, and staff from government agencies attending meetings and providing advice. In doing so, there needs to be greater flexibility in Indigenous governance to accommodate the issue of representation and to accommodate the diversity that exists. Indigenous organisations typically operate with restricted budgets, and often more funding is required to create knowledge and awareness among the people who govern these organisations about governance. Often their views about what they should do for their people or members is not consistent with good responsible governance. This places these organisations, their governors and its staff under unnecessary pressure and creates conflict and bad governance. In order for there to be good governance among Indigenous people, leaders are required. There have always been leaders in Indigenous society who can bring people together and have them moving in the same direction for the good of their people. These leaders need to be encouraged to be involved in community and organisational governance and to bring their influence with them and to assist in the training of other people. Now, leadership and representation are big issues in Indigenous governance because of the different social structures. There are descent issues, connection to land issues, language group issues, gender issues, and connection to sacred site issues that I'll talk about a bit later. So good governance among Indigenous people can create employment opportunities for people and can create regional and local economies. Good governance provides benefits to Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. It creates regional economies, resulting in less people receiving government assistance, and of course creating employment opportunities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So again, if Indigenous people want to be in more control of their own lives, their own problems, their own lands and their own issues, it is absolutely crucial that they are familiar and apply good governance. Okay? So good governance is about having structure and order and not just doing things on a willy-nilly basis. As I said, all Indigenous corporations and organisations in Australia have to adhere with Western governance regulations. Now, this means they have to provide information about meetings. So they've got to have meetings periodically. They've got to demonstrate, record who was there, that they actually did have a quorum. Now, this means that they actually had enough people to legally have the meeting. The people there have to be identified. Everything that is said needs to be recorded in what's called minutes, and all that has to be provided to the regulators, ACIKE. Okay, so each corporation has to set out when they have their annual general meetings, and they have to have them every year. They have to do that. They have to have reasons. They have to have financial accountability where they provide the regulators with all of their financial statements. Okay, so they have to adhere to a whole set of Western governance procedures, and if they don't, they can lose their funding, they can lose their status as a corporation, and even still people can end up in court, directors can end up in court. Okay, so what I want you to do now, as I said, is have a look at the ACIKE website at your own pace. Just look around and get familiar. If you have any questions, make notes, and we'll talk about them next week. And then I want you to have a look at doing the activities. The activities, they're interesting, and then they don't require too much of you. And I also want you to do the readings for week 1. Okay? So do the readings, have a look at the ACIKE website, and if you have anything that you would like to discuss based on this lecture and based on the first readings or based on the ACIKE website, please feel free to share that with us on the discussion board. Thank you for your time.